Oak. The ice on the Powder River had crept 6 inches up the bank overnight, and Nora Callett knew, in the marrow of her frozen bones, that they would not survive another sunrise out here. Oak. She pulled 4-year-old Josephine tighter against her chest, feeling the little girl's breath slow and shallow against her collarbone. Beside them, 8-year-old Miles sat with his back pressed to a boulder, his lips the color of a bruise, his small fingers wrapped around the handle of a rusted skinning knife he had found in the mud the day before. He hadn't let go of it once. Not when they slept, not when they woke to find their blankets stiff with frost. Oak. The Wind River Range rose above them in every direction, indifferent and eternal, its peaks lost in a churning mass of iron-gray cloud. November in Wyoming Territory was not a season, it was a sentence. Oak. Mama, Miles said, his voice barely clearing the sound of the wind pushing through the cottonwoods. I can hear something in the trees. Oak. Nora lifted her head. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since they had been driven off their land, to trust her son's ears before she trusted her own eyes. Oak. She listened. Oak. Beneath the constant moan of the wind, beneath the creak of ice-laden branches, there was something deliberate, a rhythmic crunch, heavy, purposeful weight moving through crusted snow. Oak. She got to her feet, keeping Josephine pressed against her hip, and picked up the only thing she had left to defend them. A river stone, smooth and dense, the size of a man's fist. Oak. She had used it once already 3 weeks ago on a man who had followed them out of Lander. She had not hesitated. She would not hesitate again. Oak. The shape that emerged from the tree line was enormous. Oak. It stopped at the edge of the clearing and simply stood there, steam rising from its breath, taking in the sight of her. A young woman, 22 years old, standing barefoot in ankle-deep snow, holding a rock above her head like she intended to bring down the sky with it. Oak. The shape was a man, or something that had once been one. He was wrapped in layers of elk hide and rough wool, his face obscured by a dark beard gone wild with the cold, his eyes, pale, almost colorless in the flat winter light, fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not hunger, not cruelty, something older and quieter than either of those things. Oak. In his left hand he held a brace of snowshoe hair by the hind legs. His right hand stayed visible and open at his side, nowhere near the rifle slung across his back. Oak. I'm not going to hurt you, the man said. His voice was the kind that came from years of talking, mostly to mountains. Low, unhurried, worn smooth. I've been watching your fire for 2 nights. Wasn't sure what to make of it. Nobody camps that small fire in this valley unless they're hiding or they're lost. Oak. Nora did not lower the stone. We're neither. Oak. The man's pale eyes moved to Miles, then to Josephine, still pressed against Nora's side with her face half buried in her mother's coat. Oak. Something shifted in him, something quiet and irreversible. Oak. Ma'am, he said, that little one is too cold. She needs to be warm before the hour's out. Oak. I know that, Nora said, her voice cracking at the edges despite everything she could do to stop it. Oak. The man looked at the rock in her hand. He didn't reach for anything. He just set the hairs down in the snow and took 1 step back, giving her the distance. Oak. My name is Elias Cord, he said. I've got a cabin on the north face, 20 minutes from here. Stone built, fire going, food on. He paused. You can keep the rock. Oak. The Wyoming frontier, in the winter of 1879, was the kind of place that separated the living from the dead with very little ceremony, and Nora Callett had been walking that line for weeks. Oak. Her husband, Franklin Callett, had been a surveyor. Quiet, deliberate, honest to a fault. He had moved them west from Ohio 3 years earlier with a land patent he had earned fair and square. A parcel of bottomland along the Popo-Agi River rich enough in grass and water to raise cattle and build something lasting. He had believed in paper, in law, in the idea that a man's name on a document meant something out here. Oak. He had been wrong about that last part. Oak. Harlan Dressler was a cattle baron who had spent 20 years accumulating land along the river valley the way a flood accumulates debris, relentlessly, indiscriminately, and without asking permission. By the time Franklin had filed their patent in the territorial office in Cheyenne, Dressler already had the county recorder, the local judge, and the sheriff of Fremont County on a quarterly retainer. The law, such as it was, wore Dressler's face. Oak. Franklin died in September. The official record called it a riding accident. His horse spooked on a familiar trail he had ridden 100 times, they said, and threw him into a ravine. Nora had seen the bruising on his wrists when they brought the body back to her. She had seen the look that passed between the two ranch hands who delivered him. She had said nothing, because saying something would have meant leaving her children in the care of people who had just watched their father be murdered and called it clumsiness. Dressler came himself 2 days after the burial. He arrived at their door in a good coat, hat in hand, his expression calibrated to something just south of sympathetic. He told her that Franklin had borrowed against the land to purchase equipment, a debt she had never heard of, secured by a ledger she had never seen, witnessed by two men whose names she did not recognize. The sum was, conveniently, exactly equal to the assessed value of the parcel. He gave her until sundown the following day. When Nora refused to sign the transfer of title, two of Dressler's men returned at dawn and began removing the furniture from her house into the yard. The sheriff, when she rode to find him, told her there was nothing he could do about a lawful debt collection. He did not quite meet her eyes when he said it. She had packed what she could carry. She had taken her children and walked north toward the mountains, toward the only direction that didn't belong to Dressler yet. She had been walking, in one way or another, ever since. She had been trying to reach her husband's cousin in a settlement north of the Owl Creek Mountains. A woman named Harriet, who ran a boarding house, and who had written once to say that if Nora ever needed something, she should come. But the early blizzard had swallowed the trail 3 days ago. And Nora had stopped knowing exactly where she was. Sometime around the second morning of following a frozen creek, she thought was heading north, but might have been heading anywhere at all. And now, in the ruins of a small campfire with a river stone in her fist, she was looking at a man who said his name was Elias Cord, and trying to decide whether the danger he represented was greater or lesser than the danger already closing in from every other direction. She looked at Josephine's lips. She made her decision. 20 minutes, Nora said, not a step more. 20 minutes, Elias confirmed. He picked up the hares. He turned and began breaking trail. The cabin was built against the rock face of the mountain the way a thing grows rather than the way a thing is constructed. The logs were massive, hand-peeled, fitted without gaps. The roof was weighted with 2 feet of snow and showed no sign of strain. A single window, shuttered against the cold, glowed faintly orange at its edges. Elias kicked the door open with his boot and ushered them in without fanfare. The warmth hit Nora like a physical thing. After weeks of wind and ice, the heat of the stone fireplace at the far wall felt almost violent in its kindness. The cabin was one large room, spare, purposeful, everything in its place. Dried herbs hung from the rafters. A cast-iron stove crouched in one corner. Pelts and snowshoes hung from pegs near the door. There was a heavy oak table, 2 chairs, and a sleeping platform built into the far wall above a row of storage trunks. It smelled like pine smoke, dried venison, and something faintly herbal she couldn't name. Elias pointed to the rug in front of the hearth. Get her down there, close to the fire. Don't let her fall asleep yet, not until she's warm all the way through. He turned his back to them immediately, moving to the stove with the hares, giving them privacy and space as naturally as if he'd been doing it all his life. Nora peeled off Josephine's outer layers with hands that had gone so numb she had to use her wrists and forearms. The little girl whimpered at the cold air on her skin and then pressed herself against the hearthstones with a sound so close to relief that Nora had to look away for a moment so neither of her children would see her face. Miles sat near the door, still holding the knife, watching Elias with the kind of vigilance that should not have been possible in an 8-year-old boy. Elias, to his credit, did not try to disarm him with words. He simply worked, pulling a blackened pot down from a hook above the stove and moving with the efficiency of a man who did not waste motion. Within minutes, the smell of rendered fat and roasting meat began to fill the cabin, and Miles's grip on the knife handle, Nora noticed, loosened by a fraction. There's dry wool in the left trunk, Elias said, still facing the stove. Blankets. Should be a smaller shirt in there. Belonged to a trapper's boy who passed through 2 winters ago and left it. Nora found the trunk and opened it. Everything was clean, folded, real. She wrapped Josephine in a blanket that smelled of cedar and lavender, and the little girl sighed and closed her eyes. Not yet, Nora said firmly, touching her cheek. Stay awake a little longer, sweetheart. Josephine opened her eyes and fixed Nora with a look of profound 4-year-old injustice. Ok. Elias set a tin cup on the floor near Nora without stepping too close. Hot broth, dark and steaming, with a piece of hard tack balanced on the rim. Ok. He went back to the stove. Ok. Nora looked at the cup. She looked at him. She handed it to Josephine first, steadying the child's hands around it. When Josephine drank, Nora felt something in her chest unlock that she hadn't known was bolted shut. Ok. You don't have a family here, Nora said. It wasn't quite a question. Ok. No, Elias said. Ok. How long have you been up here? Ok. He was quiet for a moment. 11 years. Ok. By choice? Ok. He turned and looked at her over his shoulder, and there was something in those pale eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite grief. Somewhere exactly between the two. Most choices are made for you, he said, and then you just learn to call them yours. Ok. He set another tin cup down, this one near Miles, who picked it up cautiously, sniffed it, and then drank half of it in one go with the characteristic honesty of a hungry child. Ok. Elias looked at the boy the way men sometimes look at young horses. Not sizing him up, not dismissing him, but recognizing something in him that deserved to be acknowledged. Ok. You've been keeping watch, Elias said to him. That's a good instinct. You can rest now, I've got it. Ok. Miles looked at his mother. Nora gave him the smallest nod. Ok. The boy set the knife down on the floor beside him, pulled the blanket around his shoulders, and was asleep within 10 minutes. Ok. What's your name? Elias asked her, when it was just the two of them awake, the children breathing softly in the firelight. Ok. Nora Callett, she said. Ok. His hand stopped. Ok. He was standing at the table, slicing a piece of dried venison with his hunting knife, and his hand simply stopped mid-motion. He put the knife down slowly. He turned around and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on a man's face before. Not quite recognition, not quite dread. Something more careful than either. Ok. Callett, he said. Your husband? Was his name Franklin? Ok. The blood left Nora's face. How could you know that? Ok. Elias crossed the cabin to the storage trunks. He opened the bottom one, the one she hadn't touched, and reached beneath a folded elk hide. He withdrew a leather surveying satchel, worn and water-stained, with a brass clasp she would have known anywhere. Ok. Franklin's, the one he'd carried every day of their life in this territory, the one she assumed was buried with him, or taken. Ok. She stood up without meaning to, knocking the tin cup sideways. Ok. I found that, Elias said quietly, holding it steady between his big hands. 4 weeks ago. On the south bank of the Popo Ag, half buried in river silt, about a mile downstream from where a surveyor supposedly died in a fall. Ok. Nora's hands were shaking. She took the satchel and opened it. The survey tools were still inside, wrapped in oilcloth, and tucked beneath them, folded small and tight, was a piece of paper in Franklin's handwriting. Ok. It was a letter, addressed to no one, addressed to everyone. Ok. If this is found, I need someone to know. Dressler's men followed me to the Popo Agie, crossing on September 14th. There were 3 of them. The tall one gave the order. I have written the names on the back of the land patent copy, which I have hidden where Dressler won't think to look for it. Nora will know where. Tell her, the first place she was happy. Ok. The letter ended there. The ink on the last line was smeared in dark. Ok. Nora sat back down on the floor. She pressed her hand over her mouth, but the sound that came out of her was not a cry. It was something older and harder, the sound of a truth she had already known in her body for 2 months, finally being given a shape she could hold. Ok. He was murdered, she said. Ok. Yes, ma'am, Elias said, and the man who ordered it is still out there. Ok. For 3 days, the storm held them inside the cabin, and in the way that storms sometimes force a reckoning that calmer weather allows people to avoid, it held them together. Ok. Josephine's color came back on the 2nd day. By the 3rd morning, she had discovered that Elias kept a half-tame Camp Jay named Nothing in Particular, who sometimes came to the windowsill for scraps, and she appointed herself its primary caretaker with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who has found her purpose. Ok. Miles was quieter and more watchful. He observed Elias the way a young animal observes something large that has not yet explained itself. Not with fear, exactly, but with a careful suspension of judgment. On the 2nd afternoon, Elias sat down at the table and began repairing a snowshoe frame with a strip of rawhide and a bone awl. Without a word, Miles sat down across from him and watched. Ok. After a while, Elias handed him a second piece of rawhide and showed him the pattern of the lacing with his finger. They worked in silence for 2 hours, and when the snowshoe was finished, Miles held it up and examined it with the expression of a boy who has made something real for the first time and is trying to be casual about how much it matters. Oak. That night when the children were asleep, Nora sat across the table from Elias with the coffee he had brewed. Real coffee, the last of it, which she understood was not a small thing, and they talked the way people talk when they have stopped pretending they are strangers. Oak. He told her about the valley in New Mexico where he had grown up. He told her about a woman named Vera, who had died of fever the winter after they married, in a territory so remote that by the time he understood what was happening there was no doctor within 3 days' ride. Oak. He told her how he had buried her in ground that didn't belong to them, on a homestead that was repossessed by a land agent 6 weeks later, and how he had walked north afterward without any particular destination, just the need to put distance between himself and everything flat and warm and familiar. Oak. He had ended up here. He had built the cabin himself, over a full year, stone by stone and log by log. He had decided somewhere around the 3rd year that the mountains suited him better than people did. Oak. And now, Nora said. Oak. Elias looked at the fire. Now I'm rethinking the arithmetic. Oak. Nora looked at him. He had a weathered, direct face. Not handsome in any conventional sense, but the kind of face that told the truth without being asked. A reliable face. Oak. Dressler's men know I came north, she said. Once the storm breaks, they'll come looking. He wants the land patent. He wants those names Franklin wrote down. Oak. I know, Elias said. Oak. If they find us here. Oak. They'll find more than they planned for, Elias said simply. Not as a boast, as a fact. Oak. Nora set down her cup. You don't owe us anything. You don't have to. Oak. I found that satchel 4 weeks ago, Elias said. I've been trying to figure out how to find the family it belonged to since the day I picked it up. I wasn't expecting you to walk into my clearing. He paused. But you did. Oak. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. Oak. Miles's voice came from his bedroll, quiet and not entirely asleep. Mr. Cord? Oak. Elias turned. Yeah. Oak. Are you going to make sure nobody hurts us? Oak. A long beat of silence. Oak. Yeah, Elias said. Oak. Miles turned over and went to sleep. Oak. It was the dog that woke them, not a dog that belonged to Elias. He kept no dogs, but a hound from somewhere far below, its baying cutting through the dark in the particular sharp pattern that meant it had crossed a scent it recognized. Oak. Elias was at the window in 3 seconds, his rifle already in his hands by the time Nora was on her feet. He peered through the shutter slit and went very still. Oak. How many? Nora said. Oak. 5 horses, maybe 6. He turned from the window, his voice dropping to a low, controlled murmur. They tracked us through the snow before the second layer fell. Motivated men. Oak. Nora was already moving, pulling Josephine up from the rug without waking her all the way, gathering Miles by the shoulder. Where? Oak. Elias crossed to the stone fireplace and pressed his hand flat against the left side of the back wall, feeling for something she couldn't see. He found it, a join in the mortar that was deeper than the rest, and reached for the iron pry bar hanging beside the log rack. He fit the bar into the join and pulled. Oak. The back wall of the fireplace shifted. Oak. Not the stones of the chimney itself, but a section of the rear hearth wall. Fitted stones that had been laid to move as a single unit, counterweighted, swinging inward on a pivot she could not have found in a year of looking. Behind it was darkness and the smell of deep earth and old stone. Oak. Mine shaft, Elias said. Predates the cabin, that's why I built here. He looked at Nora. Goes 200 yards north. Comes out in a drainage above the tree line. You'll be able to see the valley from there. Stay high. Stay in the trees. Oak. What about you? Oak. A voice boomed from outside, thick and pleased with itself, the voice of a man who has ridden a long way and intends to collect what he came for. Oak. Cord, we know you've got a woman and children in there. Come out and give us the Callett widow, and we'll forget we ever found this place. You've got my word as a representative of Harlan Dressler. Oak. Elias looked at Nora. Something passed between them in the space of 2 seconds. Not a plan, not a conversation, but the compressed understanding of 2 people who have each survived things that should have finished them. Oak. Get them in, he said now. Oak. She got them in. Miles first, then Josephine, still half asleep and asking a quiet question that Nora could not answer honestly in the 10 seconds she had. She pressed her lips to both their foreheads in the dark and climbed back out. Oak. You should go with them. Elias said, already positioning himself at the gun slit beside the door, the Winchester across his forearm. Oak. I'm not going with them, Nora said. Oak. He looked at her. Oak. That's my husband's name they're dragging through the snow, she said. Give me something useful to do. Oak. He held her gaze for a half-second, and then jerked his chin toward the second rifle on the wall. A Henry repeater, lever action, older but sound. You know how to use that? Oak. My husband taught me. Oak. Then cover the window. Don't shoot unless they're coming through it. Oak. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Nora's life. Oak. Elias fired once through the door slit, and one of the riders went down screaming, his horse bolting. The return fire came in a volley that shook the logs and sent splinters raining from the window frame above Nora's head. She pressed flat to the wall and waited, her hands steady in the way that hands sometimes go steady when there is no room left for anything except what needs doing. Oak. A second man tried to flank around the south wall. Nora saw him through the window, moving low, a burning pitch torch in his hand, angling for the roof. Oak. She put the Henry to her shoulder. Oak. The shot went wide, but it went close enough that the man dropped the torch in the snow and scrambled backward. Elias caught him on his next pass. Oak. Then the roof. Oak. A thrown lantern landed on the north corner, and the smell of burning pitch came through the window instantly, thick and unmistakable. Oak. Elias turned and looked at the ceiling. The firelight caught his face at a strange angle, and what Nora saw there was not what she expected. He had gone pale beneath the beard. His chest moved in short, controlled breaths. His eyes were fixed on a point above them, on the growing orange glow spreading across the roof beams, and he was somewhere else entirely. Oak. Nora crossed the cabin in 4 steps. Oak. She put both hands flat against his chest and pushed, not hard enough to move him, but hard enough to reach him. Oak. Elias. She waited. Nothing. Elias cord. She stepped into his line of sight, blocking the burning ceiling from his view. Look at me, right now. Look at me. Oak. His eyes dropped to her face. Oak. There are 2 children in that tunnel, she said. Come back. Oak. His breath went out of him in a rush, like something had been holding it. The color came back into his face. He blinked, and the man who had walked out of the tree line with hairs in his hand and his palm open was present again. Oak. The stones, he said. We go through the stones. Oak. They went. Oak. The tunnel was cold and narrow, and smelled of iron and ancient rock. Elias struck matches one at a time to light the way, burning each to the very last flicker. Nora held Josephine against her back, the little girl's arms locked around her neck, her face pressed into her mother's hair. Miles walked with one hand on the stone wall and did not make a sound. Oak. The end of the shaft was blocked by brush that had grown over it for years. Elias pushed through it first and reached back for Josephine. Then Miles, then offered his hand to Nora without ceremony. She took it. Oak. They came out high on the mountain, above the tree line, in a bowl of silence so complete it felt deliberate. Below and to the south, Elias's cabin was a pillar of orange fire and black smoke rising clean into the cold air. Oak. Around it, 5 men stood in a loose semicircle, their backs to the darkness, warming themselves on the burning remains of everything Elias Cord had built with 11 years of his hands. Oak. Nora counted them, then she looked at Elias. Oak. He was already looking at her. Oak. Stay here, he said. Keep them here. Oak. He went without another word, moving downhill through the timber with the particular silence of a man who has spent a decade learning how a mountain moves. No rifle this time. He left it against a tree without explanation, drew the long hunting knife, and disappeared into the dark. Oak. The next few minutes existed for Nora in fragments. A shout, silence, the sound of a body hitting snow. Another shout cut short, the sharp crack of a fist connecting with something solid. A horse panicking and pulling its tie line. Oak. Then from below, a single voice raised in negotiation. The foreman, she thought, the one who had called through the door, rising in pitch with every sentence. Oak. And then silence. Oak. Miles had crept to her side without her noticing. He was watching the dark below them with the same focused attention he had given the snowshoe lacing, the same willingness to learn something from what he was seeing. Oak. Is he going to be okay? Miles asked. Oak. Yes, Nora said, and she found somewhat to her own surprise that she meant it completely. Oak. Elias came back up through the trees 15 minutes later. He had a cut above one eyebrow and a look of settled calm on his face. Oak. 4 of them are tied to their horses, he said. The horses know the way down the mountain. He paused. The foreman is going to Cheyenne, voluntarily. He's going to find a United States Marshal and explain Harlan Dressler's business practices in some detail. Oak. What convinced him? Nora said. Oak. Elias considered this. Honesty, he said. I was very honest with him about his options. Oak. Dawn came slowly, the way it does in the mountains. First a gray lightening of the black, then a thin line of rose above the eastern peaks, then the full cold gold of a winter sun finding the snowfield and turning it briefly, brilliantly, into something that looked like it couldn't possibly be real. Oak. They sat together in the shelter of the drainage, wrapped in the blankets from Elias's mine cache, watching Nora's children sleep. Oak. She had the surveying satchel in her lap. She had been going through it carefully, laying each folded document on the stone beside her. The survey tools, the field notes, and then tucked in a small zippered pocket she hadn't noticed before, a folded square of oilskin. Oak. She opened it. Inside was a copy of the land patent, and written on the back in Franklin's careful surveyor's hand were 3 names. Oak. 3 names, 2 witness dates, and a brief notation. Engineer Party, Popo Agi Survey, September 14, present at the crossing. Oak. She stared at them for a long time. Oak. Is that enough, she asked, for a federal marshal? Oak. Elias looked at the paper. With the foreman's testimony and those names, that's more than enough. He paused. Dressler's empire is built on the same kind of sand his father built on. Federal land fraud. It has a way of coming apart fast once someone pulls the first thread. Oak. Nora folded the oilskin carefully and pressed it into the satchel. She held the satchel against her chest for a moment, the worn leather warm from her hands. Oak. Franklin hid the name somewhere, he said I'd know, she said quietly. He wrote the first place she was happy. She was quiet for a moment. It was the satchel. He knew I'd come looking for the satchel. Oak. Elias said nothing. He understood the particular grief of a person who has just understood exactly how thoroughly they were loved. Oak. After a while, Josephine woke up and immediately began looking for the Camp J. Oak. Miles woke up and looked at the smoldering remains of the cabin below them, and then looked at Elias and said, with the directness of a child who has decided something in his sleep, "Are you coming with us?" Oak. Elias looked at the ruins of 11 years of deliberate solitude. He looked at the mountain, pale and enormous and entirely indifferent. He looked at Nora. Oak. Where are you headed? He asked. Oak. Cheyenne first, she said. Federal Land Office. And then, she paused. I think I'd like some land that's actually mine this time. Somewhere flat enough to see trouble coming. Oak. Elias was quiet for a moment. Oak. I've been in these mountains long enough, he said, that I've forgotten what flat ground looks like. He stood up, brushing snow from his coat. I expect I could stand to remember. Oak. The following spring, Harlan Dressler was indicted on 4 counts of federal land fraud and 1 count of conspiracy in the death of Franklin Callett. The trial took 6 weeks. The foreman's testimony was detailed and specific. The names on the back of the land patent were confirmed by 2 federal surveyors, and Dressler's carefully maintained empire of purchase law and borrowed authority came apart in the courtroom with the reliable efficiency of something that was always going to. Oak. He died in a prison in Laramie 2 years later of a stroke in a room without windows. Oak. The Callett land patent was restored. The parcel on the Popo Agi River, which Dressler had immediately subdivided and sold, was the subject of a separate federal action that took 3 years and recovered a portion of its value in damages. It was enough. Oak. Nora bought 40 acres on the high plains east of Cheyenne. Not the Popo Agi land, which carried a grief she wasn't ready to live inside of, but new land, unmarked and open, with a long sight line in every direction and a good creek at the south boundary. Oak. Elias built the house. It took most of a year. He built it the same way he had built everything else. By hand without waste, fitted tight against the weather. It was not a mountain cabin. It was a house with a wide porch and 2 chimneys and enough rooms that the children each had their own. Oak. On a Sunday afternoon in late May, with the plains grass coming in green and the sky doing what the Wyoming sky does in late spring, that particular, enormous blue that looks like it goes on past the edge of all possible things, Nora stood on the porch and watched Miles teaching Josephine to fly a paper kite he had made himself, running with her through the grass, his voice carrying back to the house on the warm air. Oak. Elias came up behind her and set his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him the way a person leans against something they have decided, without any remaining uncertainty, to trust. Oak. It's quiet today, she said. Oak. It is, he said. Oak. She looked out at the long, flat, open country stretching away in every direction. The country that belonged to her, that no one could take, that she could see all the way to the horizon from the porch of the house that had been built by a man who had learned, late and hard and at great cost, that some things are worth building again. Oak. We have a roof, she said. Oak. Elias pressed his lips to her temple and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. Oak. I keep coming back to the moment Nora stood in the snow with a river stone raised above her head. No weapon, no allies, no plan beyond the next 5 seconds. Just a young woman who had already lost everything that could be taken from her, planting her feet between her children and whatever came next. That image stays with me, not because it's dramatic, but because it's true. That's what it actually looks like when a person refuses to be finished. Oak. What struck me most about Nora's story is how clearly the consequences followed the choices, on every side. Harlan Dressler built his empire on a simple calculation, that the law could be bought, that silence could be enforced, that a widow with 2 children in the middle of a Wyoming winter had no moves left. Oak. He was wrong, not because of luck, but because he fundamentally underestimated what a person of genuine character is capable of when she has nothing left to protect except what matters most. The men who do harm always seem to forget that the people they hurt are still thinking, still calculating, still deciding. Oak. And Franklin. I think about Franklin a lot. A quiet man, a surveyor, someone who believed in paper and law and the straightforward idea that honesty was its own protection. He was wrong about that, and it cost him everything. But even in the last moments he thought clearly. He hid the names where only Nora would know to look. In the place she'd told him was the first place she'd ever been truly happy. That's not luck either. Oak. That's a man whose mind stayed sharp under the worst possible pressure, who used what he had, who trusted the person he loved to be smart enough to find it. The intelligence he showed in that final act saved his family from the grave he was already in. Oak. Elias is the one I think people overlook. 11 years alone in the mountains, and not because he was broken, because he had decided that caring about people was too costly. He had done the math on love and loss and come up with a number he didn't want to pay again. I understand that. I think most people, if they're honest, understand that. Oak. The temptation to close down, to go somewhere high and cold and quiet where no one can reach you. It makes complete sense after you've been through what he went through. And yet, he picked up the satchel. He kept it. He was already looking for the family it belonged to before Nora ever walked into his clearing. Oak. That's the thing about people with real integrity. They do the right thing even when no one is watching. Even when it costs them something. Even when they told themselves they were done caring. Oak. What I take from Nora and Elias, and even from Franklin's last careful act, is something I keep trying to practice in my own life. That character is not what you have when things are going well. It's what remains when everything else has been stripped away. Nora's willingness to keep going when she had every reason to stop. Franklin's clarity of mind in the moment of his greatest fear. Oak. Elias's choice, made quietly and alone, to still show up for strangers when the world had given him every justification not to. Oak. Those 3 things together, the will to keep going, the sharpness to think clearly under pressure, and the decency to do right by people even when it's inconvenient, that's not a formula. It's just what it looks like when a person becomes someone worth knowing. Oak. Nora got her land back, but I think the more important thing she got back was herself. And Elias, standing on that porch in the spring sunlight, having built something with his hands for the first time in 11 years that was meant to last, I think he got himself back too. Oak. That seems like the point, that it's never entirely too late to build something worth staying in.